empowering excellence. Friends, today's Wednesday study circle, we have organized a very interesting topic, taxation challenges of digital economy and its recent developments. To impart knowledge on this, we have two eminent chartered accountants, CA Priya Narayanan and CA Sanjana Davar. They are both of them are expert on the topic, and they are going to enlighten us the very relevant and apt topic. And it is digital economy or e-commerce is growing day by day, and everyone is particularly the happening city Bangalore is facing a lot of issues. All of the practicing chartered accountant, those who are in taxation field, seeing those challenges. To enlighten that or to clarify all those doubts, we have arranged this study circle meet. Hearty welcome to CA Priya Narayanan. Hearty welcome, ma'am. Hearty welcome to CA Sanjan Davar. Hearty welcome, CA Sanjana. Participants, you are the reason for this program. Hearty welcome to each one of you. I'll take a minute or two to inform you about the upcoming program. On 20th of this month, just for your information, Bangalore branch has trained around 80 BCom students of RC College. RC College is a government college having more than 4,000 students studying in commerce department. And final year students 80 we have selected and trained them of 110 hours on various topics like GST, income tax, TDS, accounting, and tally accounts too, in a hands-on training in their computer lab. They are trained and available for to join the companies. So we have arranged a campus placement 20th of this month. I request to spread this message, and any one of you are looking for employees, please join in that campus placement. Please visit bangaloreici.org so you get all the information, or you can contact me also regarding that. And another 4 days workshop on company law, that is starting from 21st of October to 24th, every day in the afternoon, 3 hours learning, total of 12 hours learning company law in detail. So all the issues, nitty-gritties, all the latest developments in Companies Law and Companies Act 2013 is discussed in that workshop. I request all of you to register and also spread this message to your friends and colleagues, those who are practicing company laws. It is very important. A lot of changes are there in the Companies Act. I request all of you to register that program. Then on 26th of October, another very interesting panel discussion we have arranged based on the latest developments of NFRA's notice and all other developments. We thought it to have and understand how we have to face those challenges, statutory audit and accounting standards for MSME. It's a panel discussion. So I request all of it is a free program. It is just a CP meeting of 2 hours. I request all of you to register that program. And one more information, Bangalore branch is conducting a training program on SAP FICO, Finance and Control, SAP. So that 100 hours training we are planning to give at a very subsidized price. I request please visit Bangalore ICAI, and if any one of you interested, register, or please spread this information. Many CS and CS students or anyone who is interested to learn SAP can join that program. It is almost a 1 month, early morning 6:30 to 9:30 without disturbing your working hours. We have planned 100 hours of training in SAP. I request all of you to share this information, those who are looking for that. Otherwise, it's very expensive outside the market. Similar training costs almost 65,000-70,000, whereas we are charging just 20,000 rupees. It is highly subsidized for the benefit of our members and students. I request anyone is looking for this, please register. And I also request you to spread this message to your friends and colleagues. With that note, once again, hearty welcome to each one of you. Over to Divya.
Thank you, Chairman. A very pleasant good evening to all the participants and to both the speakers of today's program. We have with us CA Priya Narayan and also CA Sanjana Davar. To give a brief introduction about them, CA Priya Narayan is a seasoned corporate tax professional. She has been with Deloitte for more than 19 years. She is currently partner with Deloitte. She has experience in working with varied geographical markets, and her forte lies in advising on complex issues apart from routine tax matters. She has also authored articles for tax website and journals and has been an acclaimed presenter at ICI. With this very brief introduction, I welcome you, ma'am, for today's program. Hearty
Thank you.
welcome to you. Members, we also have CA Sanjana with us. She is manager with Deloitte's corporate tax practice and has post-qualification experience of over 6 years. She is graduate and member of Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. She has extensive experience in field of corporate tax laws, being part of consulting. With this very brief introduction, I welcome you also, Sanjana, for today's program.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Chairman, Mr. B.T. Shetty, for giving us this opportunity to present. Really grateful. Sanjana, we could go ahead and present the slides.
Sure. I presented it, just let me know when.
Sure. It is, yeah, I think it's loading. Not yet.
1 second.
Yes.
I think it should, yeah.
I think it is just loading.
Hmm.
Yeah, so thank you, everybody. We move to slide 3. So basically, I think, a few years back, when I first spoke in the institute, I recall coming to the auditorium, interacting with a set of live audience and presenting another tax topic. And I think interestingly, I've presented mostly international tax topics at the institute. So everything was offline, had a live audience who would question. And then a few years later, I remember when I went to present again, we had a handful of people sitting there. But curiously, I saw that there was a camera pointing at me. So when I inquired at that point in time, I was told that the entire session is being telecasted live, and members who couldn't travel down to the institute could dial in from the comforts of their office or home and listen to the session. So from a time where digital meant only slides, going to actually a webcast session where it is semi-online, semi-offline was very interesting. And today, look at us where we are. Everybody sitting in the comforts of our home. Or, I am able to sip, filter coffee, look at the weather outside, and also, present to you. Not really tired of Bangalore traffic, traveling up and down and having to come and present. And all of us can get to listen to this. And most importantly, I think, with the festivities around, we are also able to celebrate all of this with our families. So I think with all of this, I think I'm reminded of this quote that I think Sanjana has put up for us, saying, going digital is no longer an option, but it is default, by Mr. N. Chandrasekharan. So, even I think as time evolves, there are different ways in which everything evolves digitally. And there is no exception for any phase in life, including that of tax. So first of all, a very good evening to everybody. Very happy Dussehra festival to those who are celebrating. And Sanjana and I are very grateful that you took out time from your busy schedule to dial into our session. I will just walk through the content of our session today in terms of what are the areas that we are planning to cover. And we are happy to receive questions, which we will either answer it as we talk, or we will take it up towards the end, if it's a longer question. So, I think the first thing is that we will have to go through a bit of what digital economy is, how India has been looking at digital economy, after which we will look at the tax challenges that is arising in a digital economy. So while we say we are all going digital, what are the issues that the government would face on account of digital economy is very critical. So understanding that is precursor to why these levies have been introduced. That is the second aspect. India's approach is the approach the government has adopted so far in levying certain kinds of taxes or levies, which seek to tax transactions which are done digitally. After which we will briefly touch upon OECD's Pillar 1 and 2, because that in itself is a big ocean to cover. We will try and cover as much as we can for today's session. We will also cover a bit of the current withholding taxes levied on e-commerce entities. And then we will move on to, a brief overview of what are the kind of digital taxes that are there in other countries. And if time permits, we will also, walk through a couple of recent case laws and one particularly from the Bangalore jurisdiction before we wrap up. So we do have an interesting lineup of content for all of you today. And we hope that you enjoy this and find value from whatever we are, taking for you. So, coming back to the slide, I think the Indian government launched a campaign called the Digital India Program, which we have all heard many times over. And this was launched in the year 2015. This program was launched to transform the public services, ecosystem completely into a digital platform mode. So what really happens is that, if you remember, we had, income tax returns being filed online from 2006, but slowly we started migrating to certain kinds of transactions like a simple rectification being done online, to now where faceless assessments are being done. And also, I think faceless appeals have started picking up. So, there has been an evolution that we can see as tax professionals in this phase, in this entire phase. Likewise, in all areas of public service, the government has taken a lot of initiative to digitize every part of the ecosystem. In 2019, the MeitY, that is the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, conducted a survey or a research to take stock of how India as a country is digitally enabled for the upcoming years. And some of the key findings of the survey are that India is among the top 3 global economies in number of digital consumers. So we have at that point in time, we had almost 560 million internet subscriptions in 2018, and it was up from 238.71 million in 2013. India also had the second largest internet subscriptions in the world. So also, if you look at the instant messaging services users worldwide, India was only number 2 or number 2 behind China. So if you look at the number of users that we have a vast population that is actually digitally enabled. Also, when it comes to the rate of adoption of digital digitization of our country, we are the second fastest rate in terms of growth. And we are as fast as some of the developed economies of the world. Also, that means when we are growing so fast, the gap between the people who have access and who do not have access was reducing significantly. And with all of this catching up, with more digitization happening, more goods and services being bought online, more of transactions happening online, India can create up to 1 trillion economic value from digital economy by the year 2025 was the prediction. I think these were the key findings of the report that MeitY had conducted in 2019. Sanjana, we can move to the next slide. I think here we have summarized some of the issues that are prevalent in the tax laws as the economy is moving digital. So one of the key issues that we see is that the tax laws are framed in a traditional manner to tackle a brick and mortar kind of situation where the manufacturer is actually manufacturing goods, selling goods, all offline in the sense that there are physical goods moving, and maybe some services also, but not to the extent that things are evolving today. So the governments of the world started grappling with this issue that the tax laws are outdated in a way, and they don't tackle the issues faced under a digital system. So if you look at the first one, ability to have significant digital presence in another country without being liable to tax. So what really happens is today, many of us are aware that there are foreign websites that you can go, foreign brands, websites, or, market players that you can go and buy goods from. Now that person or that company may not even have any presence in India, not one employee, no physical office. All that you do is you can go buy it and then they can ship it from there and it can reach India. Now, the whole question over here is, without actually having any physical presence in India, they are able to get revenue from this country. So the question really is, shouldn't the country also be entitled to a fair share of tax for the revenue generated out of this source land? Unfortunately, if you look at the PE definition in the tax treaties or the income tax law, it only tackles the traditional form where there should be a fixed place of business in most cases. And that obviously is absent. So that is one of the key issues that come in. The second one is the shifting of profits from higher tax jurisdiction to low tax jurisdiction. Assuming you have a company that is, Europe based, and say it's situated in country A in Europe, it has a manufacturing within EU region, say in country B, and a warehouse in country C. You place an order from India, and the goods are shipped from the warehouse in country C and it comes to India. But the real question over here is that who should be entitled to what kind of profit and what kind of tax should be paid in each country for the activities undertaken. In order to reduce the overall tax rate, is there a profit shifting that is happening that needs analysis? This kind of structuring is another area where governments felt that they needed to be involved to understand the evolution and also frame rules to tackle issues around this. Another issue is also with regard to information technology companies, where the information is being shared online. Today, you, I, and all of us here could be, social media consumers, and there is a lot of information that we are sharing. Have you ever looked at, searching for a press report or an article, and a few minutes later, your phone is flooded with feeds around the same topic, and even it may go up to for a few weeks. Similarly, there is a lot of personal information, data, photos that we share online without thinking too much. Now, the real question is, all of this information is being collected, say, for example, to understand customer behavior, and that is studied to push back products and services into us, again, through an online mode. Now, shouldn't the country which is giving access to its population, which is so wide and which is so wide, be also entitled to a share of the revenue in terms of tax out of the entire transaction? I think these are the key areas that governments are grappling when it comes to digital economy. Moving to the next slide. So over here we have outlined the chronology of events so far. This entire issue of, how do we tackle the digital economy updates started somewhere way back in 2013, where the G20 OECD initiated the BEPS measures. And in 2015, we all know that there were 15 action plans, with the first one being around digital economy itself, where the OECD had come out with options to implement base erosion measures. Now, in 2018, there was an interim report that was published to provide an in-depth analysis of some of the highly digitized business models and, also potential implications that it could carry in the tax framework. 2019 is a very significant update, where the OECD's inclusive framework agreed on a policy note to group the proposals into two pillars, pillar 1 and 2, where one related to allocation and two related to a level of global minimum tax that would be enforced to avoid debt related issues. 2020, there were blueprints of the two pillars that were proposed that was published. 2021, we have two significant updates. There was a statement in June that was released with the countries agreeing to a two-pillar solution, and more recently that countries have agreed to most of the recommendations that had come in through the pillar 1 and 2. So I think on the most recent one being 8th October, there was a path-breaking agreement that was reached among 136 countries on this two-pillar solution. So these are the developments from a global standpoint, which we will cover in a little more detail. But for the time being, these are high-level introductions. So the other challenges that we also look at is that there are multiple areas under which the OECD is working. We have the governments being involved, we have media outlets, we have civil society around the world that have expressed that there have been issues around the tax planning, and that is where OECD has come in to say that they will look at action 1 and address it. So with this, we will wrap up, the introduction part of the discussion. I will now hand it over to Sanjana to walk through the various measures of the OECD recommendation and India's approach.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Priya. So I think moving on from what Priya has just spoken about, when we talk about OECD's recommendations that were first introduced as part of its 2015 report on Action 1, there were three broad guidelines that OECD had raised to address tax challenges of the digital economy. The first one was around a new nexus rule for significant economic presence. Now, when we talk about significant economic presence, what the OECD really sought to do was create taxing rights of a source jurisdiction, even in absence of a physical presence of that enterprise in the source jurisdiction. And here, when we say significant economic presence, this would be created by significant interaction digitally with customers in India. Say, if you're understanding it in the in the Indian context, and frequent interactions with customers in India. So that was the idea behind significant economic presence. Equalization levy was amongst one of the other alternative ways to tax digital economy. Now, equalization levy in common parlance can be understood to mean a digital tax. The idea behind equalization levy, I think, comes from the very base of the tax challenges of the digital economy. So today, an issue that several governments sort of encounter is to say that if there is a domestic seller in a country or like a local seller, vis-a-vis there is an international, say, seller, while the domestic seller is paying taxes, say, in the Indian context in India, by virtue of having a physical presence, an international seller who is present in India by way of a digital mean is not really getting subjected to tax. So equalization levy was supposed to sort of bring parity between a domestic and a foreign enterprise on that account. And also addressing, say, the larger challenge around digital economy today, that our traditional brick and mortar taxation rules create a charge of tax in the source jurisdiction only when there is a physical presence. But there in a digital economy, how do you really tackle that when a foreign enterprise is present in several jurisdictions without having a physical but a virtual presence? The third was tax on certain digital transactions. So this would again be levied when there was a non-resident, say, seller or say a non-resident service provider who would sell goods or say sell services in the source jurisdiction to residents in that country. And then, of course, as regards withholding tax on digital transactions, this would be introduced, say, on certain specified services and goods only. So these were the recommendations that were given by the BEPS Action 1 report. And at that point in time, when this had come in 2015, along with the other action plans, I think the initial thoughts that had gone, behind this also was that these were to be recommendatory in nature, and the other, measures that were coming to address BEPS-related issues, they would say get tackled by, the parallel amendments that OECD was bringing in. So these were optional at the time that they had come in. Now, moving to the Indian context here. So India, along with several other countries, had accepted this report and had provided a broad consensus on it. Now, the Central Board of Direct Taxes had constituted a taxation of e-commerce committee, and that committee had sort of undertaken an analysis of the sort of challenges in the digital economy that were being faced in India, and then the way to sort of address them. If we go through this report as well, this had placed a heavy reliance on the BEPS Action 1 report, the one that we just discussed previously, and on those measures itself. Now, as part of this report, the committee had noted, say, one thing, to state that equalization levy at that point in time is a relatively simplistic amendment to bring in the tax laws. Now, the reason being that equalization levy could have been introduced in a separate chapter without really having to amend tax laws and without having to amend a number of tax treaties. So to that extent, this would have been administratively convenient. And one additional fact is the idea of even the BEPS Action 1 report that this equalization levy did take cue from was to tax, or rather to charge equalization levy again on significant economic presence. So that has always been the idea that if you're present in a jurisdiction digitally without being present physically, and that presence is significant and is resulting in significant generation of revenue, then there are levies in place to create a charge of tax on this. So that being the idea. Now, equalization levy was first introduced in the year 2016. Now, that was a relatively limited levy. It was on advertising and certain allied advertising services and support services. And the rate of tax that time was 6%. Prior to introduction of equalization levy at the rate of 6%, I think there was some litigation around the characterization of online advertising payment as, say, royalty or fees for technical services under the Act and tax treaties. Because advertising, the way that that we see today and the way that it has evolved, is not really a very like a simple physical transaction. It is a transaction that that entails extensive real-time updates and, say, incidental access to servers and technology, etc. So then the question really prior to introduction of this levy, would have been as to whether such an advertising also fall within the purview of royalty fees for technical services. With this introduction, the characterization of payments had become fairly clear. Advertising had to be subjected to tax at 6% under equalization levy, and once that charge came in, there was no further taxation under the income tax laws. And the other interesting
I have one question for you, Sanjana, here. So, when you're talking of equalization that got levied, first in 2016, the question is that who was liable to tax? Whose liability was it, and was there a withholding? How does it work? Is it the non-resident's responsibility or the Indian entity's responsibility?
So thanks, Priya, for that one actually. So when this levy was initially introduced, it was the liability of the Indian payer to collect and to pay it. And similar to how, say, a withholding tax return works, this would have to be deposited periodically, and an annual return would have to be filed disclosing the details of these transactions.
So we are talking of a levy. So when, for example, today, if I'm sitting abroad and you are paying me for some advertisement services, on my invoice, you will not withhold taxes, but the equivalent value of taxes would have to be, deposited to the government. Is that right?
Yes, that is the understanding. So as equalization levy was introduced first, it was a compliance requirement for the Indian resident payer. both the deposition and the subsequent filing as well. And this was a levy that would not be creditable either, right? So that was the other interesting aspect here. And once a payment was subjected to equalization levy, there would be no further charge under the Income Tax Act, either as, say, a royalty or an FTS. Now, the next interesting amendment around equalization levy came in the Finance Act 2020. Now, with this, the scope of equalization levy had expanded substantially. While equalization levy at the rate of 6% in 2016 was introduced on certain specified advertising services, the levy that was introduced in 2020 was on online sale of goods or online provision of services that was facilitated by an e-commerce platform. Now, when we say goods and services facilitated by an e-commerce platform, the amendment came along with a lot of interpretational challenges as to what could really be the scope. Because today, if we look at any transaction, it is, and especially with a non-resident, it is not really practically feasible to conclude it without having any sort of online involvement. Say, in a transaction, even if the entire life cycle really gets concluded physically, payment is, say, one residuary thing that, that practically does not get executed in any way other than on an online platform. So at that point in time, when this provision was introduced, the question really was what constitutes an online sale of goods. So does that mean the entire transaction has to take place online? And when we say that a transaction is facilitated online, what really is the scope of it? For instance, say today, if on a Google search I try looking for a product and it redirects me to a link of a non-resident outside India, is the non-resident there facilitating a payment and therefore liable to equalization levy? Or is that really practically feasible to track? So the introduction of those provisions came along with all of those questions. Apart from taxing e-commerce supply and e-commerce provision of services, this levy was also introduced on income received by non-residents from sale of advertisement targeted to Indian customers, and also sale of data collected from Indian resident or a person using Indian IP address. I think we'll just connect this back also to the slide that Priya was explaining to us on, really attributing value to data. So in the BEPS action report of 2015, where I think the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has really spoken about the policy challenges of a digital economy. One, I think, area that has been specifically quoted is data. So the challenge today really becomes that, where data is seamlessly available everywhere, and they say everybody can buy it, sell it, use it, say, to their advantage and end up creating economic value. How does one, sort of assign value to that data and create a charge of tax on it? So I think with the development of digital economy, that is an aspect that has sort of gained a lot of importance. So the provisions when they were first introduced were, say, more generic and I think fairly broad in their scope. So I mean, through the year, I think when this was first introduced, there was, over our discussions as well, I think there was a lot of curiosity around whether there will be, say, any FAQs around it or not, or how does one implement it, etc. But the Finance Act 2021 amended the definition of online sale of goods and online provision of services to define what that really means, bringing in clarity provisions, also really explaining the wide application of the provisions. Now, what Finance Act 2021 said was that equalization levy provisions are applicable when either one or a combination of the following activities are undertaken online. Say, accepting an offer for sale, placing a purchase order, acceptance of a purchase order, payment of a consideration. And I think this being the most tricky one, because I think, like we said, it might not be possible to even conclude a non-resident transaction without paying consideration online, and supply of goods or provision of services partly or wholly. Now with this coming in, the application of these provisions had widened, and I think along with it, came a set of further questions that we have sort of tried to address in the next slide that we will be walking you through. And these are some common practical issues that that have come up and that I'm sure a lot of us have been looking at. The first one being, does equalization levy apply to digital goods or also to physical goods? Now, equalization levy, when was first introduced in Finance Act 2020, considering that the idea was really to tax transactions in the digital economy, a plausible view could have been only covered digital goods and services. But with the amendment in Finance Act 2021, where even a fragment of a transaction was considered as part of an online sale of online sale or online provision of services, a more reasonable sort of intent seemed to be that even physical goods could get subjected to equalization levy. So even sale of physical goods on an online platform could get subjected to equalization levy. I think the other question that comes up when, say, we look at the definition of what constitutes online sale of goods and services is that if I cover of every fragment of a transaction in within the scope of equalization levy, is there something that is getting really left out? I think one such instance and one such area of discussion would be, can a mere listing of a product and prices on the portal or an online query also constitute online facilitation of goods or online sale? Say a typical example could be today, if I want to open a website, say I just Google a website and they have a contact us page and they allow us to say put in a query. I could say raise anything, say what is the price of your product or how do we approach, etc. So does something like that also constitute equalization? Does that also trigger equalization levy, and can that be called an online facilitation of goods or service? Now, here again, when we look at the definition, while an online listing is not really covered in the definition of online sale of goods or online provision of services, but the challenge really comes from the fact that the definition itself is inclusive. So if at all, I think for a taxpayer, if he is to leave out any transaction, from the scope of online provision of goods or services, then there is no specific carve out under the equalization levy provisions as such. So with that, really the question becomes, how do I align the intent of this provision to my facts of the case, and then to what extent does that really apply? Now, similarly, say in the previous example, if if a line of argument were to be that an online inquiry should not as such constitute, should not constitute online sale of goods or services. Taking that example, say, to the next step, if there is a third-party vendor that is receiving online inquiries on behalf of, say, several parties on its portal, and if it's charging a fee for it from these third-party sellers, does that constitute an online provision of services? So there again, the question really comes is that while the transaction, like with the customer, might have some avenue for analysis and say might just get excluded from the provision of equalization levy. But if the transaction between the third-party seller and the online portal that is taking queries, if that is again concluded on an e-commerce platform, that could again trigger equalization levy provisions. These are again a few typical issues. I mean, there could obviously be several iterations of it. Today, apart from this, we have redirection of traffic, which is extremely common. Say today, if I log into a platform, I can get redirected to several others. Then again, does equalization levy apply on the platform that is redirecting me or not? And if, say, there are two e-commerce operators involved, then on which one should I charge equalization levy? Similarly, one of the more common questions was, does a one-to-one telephone communication or an email communication trigger equalization levy provision? And yet again, an email communication is a more fundamental means of communicating with the non-resident party, because practically that could potentially be the only way that it can be done. Now, does that trigger equalization levy? I think here one line of, say, just thought, and of course this will have to be evaluated on a case-to-case basis, is that a digital or electronic facility or a platform is, in just common parlance, can be understood something that has a mass reach. Now, a one-to-one telecommunication or, say, a one-to-one mail communication may not really achieve that objective of the mass reach. But yet again, the frequency of such communications, say, or the messages getting conveyed on such communications, etc. So those again have to be looked at on a case-to-case basis. There is no specific carve out here. Amongst the other areas that has been of, I think, and this I understand might have been one of the most discussed areas, would be the impact on intra-group transactions. Now, most say multinational enterprises that have, say, locations across countries, right? They would have, say, some sort of a cost pooling or, say, a cost sharing scenario. So potentially there could be several instances, say, where there is a foreign associated enterprise or a foreign related party. It has, say, some Indian subsidiaries, additionally some other subsidiaries. And that foreign enterprise might be providing some services. Say that could be like a typical IT support, or say like a software relicensing, or any sort of, say, like accounting support, etc. So anything of that sort. And of course, when you do have so many entities in a network, it's just from a commercial standpoint, those synergies really help to have it at one place and then distribute that everywhere else. Now, when this is done, does this entail equalization levy? Because these transactions are not really getting entered into with third parties, and these are really being done within group entities. Now, interestingly, here again, there is no specific carve out. So to say outrightly rule it out may not be possible. But again, as a line of thought to it, we can take a step back and understand the mere rationale of introduction of equalization levy. So I think, as we discussed, equalization levy was introduced in order to ensure parity between domestic enterprises and international enterprises that can transact with several jurisdictions without having a physical presence. At the bottom of it, what we really, at the bottom of it, intent really is to charge a wider market outreach. So if a foreign enterprise is really able to reach out to several jurisdictions by its activities digitally, then that is what we're trying to create a charge on. Now, intra-group transactions typically are, a set of transactions that do not meet any of those purposes in the first place. So an intra-group transaction is not, really to create any sort of a mass market outreach. It is just to sort of, ensure cost pooling and cost optimization, say, between group entities and, say, for administrative convenience. So as such, an intergroup transaction does not have any commensurate domestic, say, a replication in model for it to get covered by equalization levy. But here again, the idea really is to also to see how this is getting executed. So say, for example, there is a foreign enterprise and it has paid to a third party to provide services to its Indian associated enterprise. Now, if the third party is rendering those services directly to Indian, associated enterprise, the equalization levy exposure there, say, could be a tad bit lower compared to a scenario where the foreign enterprise is first pooling all resources and then passing it on. So there, the equalization levy exposure on the foreign enterprise to that extent will have to be looked at, not only from the services provided, but also the mode in which these are actually being passed on. That is the other area that we look at. I think one other interesting aspect of equalization levy, I mean, it's not a part of this slide, but I think just as we are discussing it, would be the impact of equalization levy provisions and their interplay really with the provisions of tax treaties after the engineering analysis Supreme Court ruling was pronounced this year. So just to sort of, and I'm sure most of us would be aware. So earlier this year, the Supreme Court had overturned the Samsung ruling that was pronounced in the case of Karnataka High Court, and thereby had concluded that a simpliciter sale of software that does not really grant commercial rights to the buyers or the customers does not, and such an arrangement does not constitute royalty. Now, equalization levy is charged on a transaction. Such a transaction does not get subjected to royalty or fees for technical services. So a transaction that is subject to the equalization levy falls outside the scope of the Income Tax Act. Now, an aspect that again came into a lot of discussion is that after the Supreme Court ruling, for all those transactions that fell outside of the ambit of a royalty fee for technical services. Now, for all of those, does equalization levy need to be looked at again? Because for so long as they were part of royalty fees for technical services, I think this might not have been as much of a trigger. But then once you sort of exclude them there, then does EQL need to be evaluated in further detail? So, sorry, this is the first, I think, measure in the Indian context that we discussed. We move on to the provision of section 194O.
So, Sanjana, just one point over here before we move on. I think on the intra-group transactions, there have been quite a bit of uncertainty on how that has to be levied and what we should be doing. I think that is probably one of the biggest concerns today that remains to be addressed, especially in large M&E cases, that these transactions that we execute between the parent entity and the subsidiary entity. It is obviously, one item of the workflow can obviously happen always online. And in today's scenario, even the raising of purchase order, the starting point itself is all online. Even the interaction prior to that could be email. So everything is online. And I think that is where probably some clarity is expected. Just to understand, because I think the intent of the levy was to tax all digital transactions or transactions where people are able to sell digitally into the country and, garner revenues out of it without, probably getting subject to tax rules. So I think this is an area of concern, and this probably will be addressed soon. Yeah, we'll hope for that.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Coming to the next, I think, set of measures, the introduction of section 194O, which states that any sale of goods that is, or a provision of services that is facilitated by an e-commerce operator through its digital or electronic facility. In such a case, the e-commerce operator is required to withhold taxes on the e-commerce participant. An e-commerce participant is a person who sells goods or provides services on an e-commerce platform. Now, this levy was introduced at the rate of 1%, and similar to all other withholding provisions, this had to be charged at the time of payment or credit, whichever is earlier, and it took effect from 1st October 2020. We've just pictorially depicted it. I think the intent is essentially to have three parties. There's a customer, there's an e-commerce operator, and there is an e-commerce participant. So in this case, what we're looking at is that if an e-commerce participant, and an e-commerce participant again is a seller on an e-commerce platform, is selling goods to a customer through listing it on an e-commerce operator, then in such a case, when the e-commerce operator pays consideration to the e-commerce participant, the operator is required to withhold taxes at the rate of 1% on the gross consideration paid to the participant. Now, I think another interesting aspect of this provision is that if at all there is a scenario where, and this is typically there, this is prevalent in certain cases in the industry as well. If there is a scenario where an e-commerce operator is not really collecting considerations from the customers, and if the customer is directly paying to the e-commerce participant, even in those cases, the e-commerce operator is required to comply with these provisions. Of course, there could then be a separate agreement between the operator and the participant as to the recovery of taxes. But then the section makes it amply clear that anything that is facilitated on a platform, regardless of who really gets the payment or credit, the operator is required to comply with this requirement, and the rate of tax is 1%. Now, so in instances, say where an individual or a Hindu undivided family, or say like for a small taxpayer who does not have significant sales on an e-commerce platform, there is a threshold provided of 5 lakhs. And where the e-commerce participant say does not furnish a PAN, then in that case, a withholding tax rate of 5% is applicable. And an e-commerce operator is defined to mean a person who owns, operates, or manages a digital or electronic facility, a digital electronic facility or a platform. And an e-commerce participant is any person who is a resident in India, and that being the key. So a participant needs to be a resident in India, selling goods or providing services, including digital products through digital or electronic facility or platform for electronic commerce. So in a scenario where an e-commerce participant does not furnish his PAN, withholding tax at the rate of 5% becomes applicable. And the provisions, like as we mentioned, have come in effect from 1st of October 2020. Now, what really happens is that even similar to, I think, all digital levies, even this section came with a lot of discussion around how does this really have to be now operationalized. I think one among the more common issues here was the treatment of sales return in case of e-commerce transactions. Now, I think all of us might, be fairly aware of the fact that, and as consumers, or I'm sure on several e-commerce platforms, that an e-commerce, industry as such is characterized by a certain portion of sales returns. So, normally e-commerce participants today do provide that option that the customers can return their products or services within a specified period of time. Now, with that in mind, the provisions of Section 194 are leviable on the gross consideration received. So, as such, there is no window under these provisions to net off any sales return that happens for the e-commerce participant. Now, with this, the challenge really comes is that, for an e-commerce participant who's paying, for whom withholding tax is getting applied on 1% on his gross sales, if say a certain part, or say in a case a significant part of it is getting returned, then to that extent, it sort of places the working capital under certain strain for that e-commerce participant. And say even apart from that, from an overall control, reconciliation, finalization standpoint, for such an e-commerce participant, when he is to say draw up his finances at the end of the year, and if he were to say provide his, his sales or his sales return, etc., while the finances which give him like a net sales figure, if he were to look at his Form 26A, that would have say a much higher withholding tax levy and a higher sales number. So withholding tax on sales return, and I think operationalization of has been a challenge with these provisions. Now, I think the other point really to note here is that I think as we had seen in the introductory slide for this section, this levy is triggered when we have three entities. So there needs to be a customer and an operator and a participant. Now there could be scenarios where the operator and the participant could be the same entity. Say typically if a company is listing its own products on its own platform and say selling it to customers, in such a scenario, equalization levy cannot, 194 TDS cannot get triggered for the reason that the e-commerce participant and the e-commerce operator are the same person, and therefore, in absence of the tri-party relationship, there is no TDS provision that applies. Now, again, things similar to I think other TDS provisions. A key question here was when we say gross consideration, does that mean consideration inclusive of GST, or does that have to be exclusive of GST? So here again, I think relying on circulars in the context of Section 194 in the previously, I think on possible position from the time that this was introduced, could have been that when 194O is levied, it can be done on the like one possible position was that if it is done, it can be on the amount excluding GST. I think, and yet again, considering how the digital economy is evolving, and when we talk about goods or services, one amongst the questions that gets raised is that today for all of these new instruments that we have, these prepaid instruments, these vouchers, and these products as such, that otherwise are used as means to buying goods and buying services, whether 194 provisions need to apply to that. And I think one area of discussion that has been there with the introduction of these provisions is that goods and services is not really defined here. So then if I am looking at a definition of goods, and when I'm looking at, say, extremely digitized products, and I'm looking at coupons or I'm looking at vouchers, etc., then how do I differentiate, or how do I conclude whether those are goods or not, and whether they will trigger a levy or not? So I think in such a case, while some sort of guidance can be gathered from other laws, say there is a Sale of Goods Act, or say there's a GST law, etc. But there again, that would have to, done with a lot of caution here, because at least for tax laws, or say for a GST law, say, or the definition of goods, is limited for the purpose of that levy. So then the question really comes around, if I really am looking at common parlance, where do I rely, or where do I rely on the definition of goods to cover it here? So I think that was one key. Priya, would you like to add anything before we move on to significant economic presence?
Yeah, so I think we've had a couple of levies that have come in. We've had the equalization levy come in, which is not really part of the Income Tax Act, introduced as Finance Act, but administratively still linked to Income Tax Act. And if you also look at the way that the BEPS action originally recommended, it was meant to be kind of an indirect tax. So I think that's one levy that we're looking at. When it comes to e-commerce transactions, we have the withholding tax that applies on the transactions, that is done between the e-commerce operator, participant, and the customer. So I think these are the couple of areas that India has introduced. But we will move over to a new area that has been there in the law for a couple of years, but has been enforced, or rather it has come into force only from 1 April 2021, which is the significant economic presence, or the SEP laws as we call it.
And I think one other key point to add with this, for these provisions, is that when 194O got amended, or rather 194O got introduced, the provisions of section 204, which talk about person responsible for withholding taxes, were also amended. So with that, so those provisions were amended to include non-residents or any other person authorized by a non-resident as a person responsible for withholding taxes. Now, with that change, the intent really seemed to be the fact that while 194O TDS should apply when the participant is a resident, but where the operator is a non-resident, there also potentially these provisions can trigger. This again aligning with the BEPS recommendations to say withholding tax on e-commerce transactions. I think to some extent that gets covered here as part of this introduction. And therefore, that is one area to watch out for. Interestingly, considering that 204 was amended and made as much wider by introducing, by including non-resident within that definition, the question really comes around whether all other provisions, that we see in Chapter 17, we do that also need to be complied with, by non-residents. Considering considering the definition itself starts, sort of stands amended, does do non-residents also need to comply with, say, 194 AIJ, etc.? So while that really does not seem to be the intent of the amendment, but yeah, that is actually an area that has, maybe just been let a little loose and would need to sort of be, I think, would need to have been addressed. And prior to this amendment, the general understanding, and rather the general application of withholding tax provisions was for, for those non-residents that had a presence in India, of course, with the exception of section 195, which was amended post the Vodafone ruling to say that even a non-resident who's, who's paying any income chargeable to tax in India is required to withhold taxes. So that was one, say, exception carved out. But here again, with this introduction, or rather with this introduction of these provisions and the amendment in section 204, the idea really seems to be to cover non-residents also, to to sort of tell them to comply with the provision. So that is one change as well to watch out.
Sure. Thanks, Sanjana. I think you have summarized, some of the areas where India has implemented BEPS Section 1, especially in relation to equalization levy, and some of the areas which are still not very clear. As with any new law, we will give it some time to evolve, both from the taxpayer side and the tax authority side, for them to determine, what's the best way to clarify some of these positions. So I think that was a good summary, and we will move on to significant economic presence, being the next area of discussion. When you look at non-resident taxation, you always start off first with the income tax law and look at which is the charging provision. And once you determine which is the charging provision, what is the tax applicable and what is the rate, you then travel to treaty through section 90, which gives you the benefit of going to the treaty should there be one between India and the country of residence of the other taxpayer. So that's typically how you would travel to the treaty. Now, when you come to section 9, the concept of business connection is one of the ways in which, if a non-resident has presence in India for his business, it gets taxed in India. So the question is that business connection definition has been there for a very long time, since the beginning in the tax laws, and now we are looking at that definition to help us with an amendment that can tax the current scenario of digital transaction. So with that in mind, in order to customize, if I may say so, to tax digital transactions is where the government decided, and obviously, in line with the recommendations under BEPS Section 1, to introduce a definition for SEP under explanation 2A to section 911, where the definition was inserted with effect from 1 April 2022, which is essentially financial year 21-22 and assessment year 22-23 onwards, to tax certain transactions. Let's look at the transactions and also the threshold that was notified earlier this year by an rule. So what is significant economic presence? So you have business presence in India, but you do not have a physical presence, for example. I'm just taking one example. And you're still able to sell into Indian soil. That was the original intent with which this started. There are two limbs. It is either or, which therefore means you can get taxed under the first one or under the second one. There is no requirement to get fulfilled under 1 and 2. The first limb says, if there is a transaction in respect of any goods, services, or property carried out by the non-resident with any person in India, including the provision of download of data or software in India, provided the revenue threshold exceeds the monetary threshold. And the monetary threshold has been prescribed to be 2 crore rupees. So if there is a transaction where a non-resident is selling goods into India, is selling services into India, or selling any other property into India, and it is with the person in India rather, then such a transaction will be subject to tax in India if it exceeds 2 crore rupees. Secondly, where there is a systematic and continuous soliciting of business activities or engaging in an interaction with users beyond a prescribed threshold, which has been prescribed at 3 lakh in India, that can also lead to SEP. That is to say, for example, you have a website using which you are selling goods into India or any services into India, and you have absolutely no presence in India, then that can also lead to a SEP being triggered for the non-resident in India, so long as there is some volume, and the volume that we are looking at is 3 lakh users in India. So there is a threshold for monetary value in certain transactions, and there is also a user threshold that has been prescribed. And either or we meet, then the SEP provisions get triggered. It is also clarified that the non-resident, in order to constitute an SEP in India, need not have the agreement signed in India. It can be signed anywhere outside as well. And it doesn't matter whether the non-resident has a residence or a place where he conducts his business from in India. So irrespective of whether there is a real fixed place or not, or a physical place or not, he can satisfy the definition of SEP and be subject to tax in India. There is also another clarification saying that the non-resident need not render services in India. That is to say, he need not travel to India, come here, sit and render services. It can be rendered from anywhere in the world. And if the definition of SEP under 2 limbs are met, it can still be subject to tax in India. Obviously, with any tax law where, it involves 2 countries, there is an allocation that is required and there's an attribution. So India will tax only so much of income as is attributable to the specified transaction or activities that deem to accrue or arise in India. This is the background of SEP, which has come into force from 1st of April 2021. And the monetary threshold and the user threshold was prescribed earlier this year and is active. Now, when it comes, to some of the issues, we read that the intention, like in the case of equalization levy, was only to tax transactions that are entered into between 2 parties in a digital mode, or the intention is to tax those transactions. So the first question is that would it cover physical goods, non-digital services, and non-digital property? Yes, because the language does not really say physical goods and it doesn't say non-digital services. So therefore, all kinds of goods and services seem to be subject to tax under the new SEP rules. The next issue is around the withholding tax obligations. And I will just read out the question that we have framed for you. Where a non-resident payee contends that it does not have an SEP in India, would tax withholding be required? And just to step back a bit, I think I must also clarify that what happens if there is a treaty benefit available. So if there's a treaty benefit available via Section 90, the treaty would override the domestic laws, and therefore the treaty will become, applicable. Whereas where there is no treaty benefit available, obviously we come back to the domestic laws and rely on that. In a case where there is no treaty benefit available and the non-resident contends that it does not have a SEP in India, would there be a withholding required? Like in, your regular business connection cases, even what, non-SEP cases, whatever business connections have been evaluated in India so far, like in those cases, if there's an income chargeable to tax under 195, as clarified by the Supreme Court decisions, only then will there be a withholding requirement. So it is not really dependent on SEP, because SEP is a charging provision. The withholding tax provision comes in under 195, and that goes back to the regular definition you would apply for any business connection. The second question is that in case the non-resident has business connection in India on account of explanation 2A, can treaty benefit be allowed at tax withholding stage? Yes. So treaty benefit is available even where there is even where there is SEP, but the treaty benefit availability is subject to obviously the documentation that we've been used to for a few years now around 10F and the TRC and all of that. So I think with that having said, yes, in principle the treaty benefit should be available. Now, when it comes to the attribution of income, can it be said that there is no attribution rule and therefore the income cannot be attributed? No, because the second proviso to explanation 2A of 911, which clarifies the SEP definition, does not require any rule to be prescribed for attribution. So therefore, even without having rules for SEP, the SEP provisions can get triggered. Rules for attribution, I mean. And if the treaty benefit is not available, and then what happens? How does one determine the taxable income? And I think we do have wherever treaty provisions are not available, then the determination will be definitely difficult because there's no specific rule. However, the tax authorities may can the tax you can seek for a specific ruling from the tax authorities, and you should also look at attributing a reasonable level of income for the activities conducted in India, like the way that you would do in any other arm's length transaction pricing. I think the other issue is in relation to who is a person in India, because SEP applies for transactions when non-residents have transactions with person in India, and it would also include branches, because the person in India definition is quite vast, and even if an NR has a branch in India, that can get covered. The second question is around what transactions can be covered. I think illustratively we have put out a list which is there for reference. And does explanation 2A of 911 apply when income is subject to tax as royalties, FTAs under the domestic laws? So basically the provisions, if you look at even under the current scenario, are no different, where 911 applies. So it really goes by the royalty FTAs definition because it's specific source of income, and only then if you establish a business connection, you come to 911. So similar rules would apply. It's not going to be very different from that because the principles of taxation still remain the same as is today, and we are only expanding the definition of business connection. So that's something that we can always keep in mind, that it is not really going to change the way that we look at things, but the definition of business connection is largely expanded. I think that's what I had to say on SEP. Sanjana, is there something additional that you would like to add over here?
I think.
Sanjana, we can't hear you. You might have to be a little louder, please.
Yeah. Is this better? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I think, yeah, thanks for this. I think one similarity, I think notably, is equalization levy and significant economic presence have similar thresholds of INR 20 million. So I think that's one thing that gets covered. And I think, as Priya also rightly said, this gains much more significance in cases where there isn't treaty protection. And I think then the scope of this levy is a lot wider. Once we do look at treaty protection, then business connection typically is something, and I think that's something that all would have seen at some point in time as well, where treaty is typically more restrictive than the act when it comes to business connection versus permanent establishment. And then we take recourse to the definition of permanent establishment and then check if that income needs to be taxed on gross basis or not, or say in absence of a permanent establishment, and if the income is in the nature of business income, then if it can fall completely beyond the scope of taxation. So significant economic presence might not really impact those cases as much where there isn't, where there is a treaty protection, but then where there isn't one is where I think we have something to watch out for.
Thanks, Sanjana. And I think we will move over to the latest hot happening topic in the international tax arena around OECD's Pillar 1 and 2. In October 2021, which is on 8th of October, as recent as last Friday, an agreement was entered into, or rather reached, between 136 countries on the way to tax digital economy. And there is a two-pillar solution-based approach. So the pillars that we refer to is a solution that the governments have come up with to tax transactions. We have Pillar 1 and we have Pillar 2 on both the OECD recommendations. So we have Pillar 1, which talks about the allocation of profits to market countries. And certainly we can go back to the earlier slide. We'll come back to this in a bit. Yeah. So pillar 1, which talks of allocation of profits to market countries, and it also removes all the existing digital service taxes that are there in the relevant economies, which includes the question of equalization levy being done away with once probably this OECD pillar 1 and 2 comes in. And pillar 2, which prescribes a global minimum tax, at the current moment prescribed at 15%, and on a country by country basis. So these are the 2 pillars that we are looking at. Pillar 1 largely revolving around the nexus-based approach. So if you look at, specifically around pillar 1, the new framework that is there, which is coming as pillar 1 and 2, is for taxing MNCs who have a euro 20 billion sales or upward. That is at the global level. And you might be looking at the IFRS accounts. If the group has a turnover exceeding 20 billion sales, then it can be subject to, then it can, fall under this. It appears to be slightly more simpler than many of the complex rules that we have come across so many days. And also, it will hopefully do away with many of the local digital tax provisions, and we'll have a simple single solution that is adopted across the world. And it's probably first time in the world that this kind of a policy adoption for taxes is being reached at. And also, instead of going to a rule-based scenario of deriving and attributing profit, what is being looked at is a turnover-based approach. That is to say that, if you have a turnover that is derived from a specific jurisdiction, then it would probably, the tax attribution would be higher for the market jurisdiction. So we are looking at a FAR-M approach, which is the function as risk plus market analysis, for attributing of profits. Also, it is expected that companies will designate one of their group entities as a tax-paying entity, which is likely to be the parent entity because, likely that the decision and control is from the parent entity in most cases. And some countries will garner additional revenue from it, whereas some others may actually lose out because of the natural way in which it is designed. The turnover derivation is usually where customers are situated. So it is like a GST in a way because you have consumption-based model, and here we are looking at the market-based model. So that way, it is turnover derivation. The next item over here is also that there is a concept called even before we get into that, if you look at the scope that's covered, we have 2 broad arms which is getting covered, which is automated digital services and consumer facing services. And automated digital services, illustrative list includes online search engines, social media platforms, online intermediaries, digital content streaming. Whereas if you look at consumer facing businesses, we look at personal computing, businesses relating to clothing, apparel, branded branded products, and similar such arrangements, including automobiles. So this is largely the scope of the areas that it targets to cover. And coming back, or rather, if you move over to the next slide, we have what is called as the allocation method that's there, or the key concepts that there, which is the amount A and amount B. And amount A is particularly looking at allocating the taxation to the participating countries. So the allocation, to countries where only market and distribution is there is using the arm's length pricing. And then you have a turnover nexus which is defined, which is basically when customers are located and services are consumed will be dealt through the turnover rules depending on where the customers are located. And also countries will have to give in taxing these companies through other forms such as equalization levy, and if there is some kind of GST on these transactions in some countries. TDS also will be simplified. And essentially what we are looking at is taxing amount over and above the threshold. So if there is currently the threshold of PBT prescribed is 10%, and if there is the PBT, if there is a PBT of 35%, then the excess is, then amount A is nothing but 25%. It's a very simple calculation, but yeah, there are some iterations around it, on how to interpret it and how to go about this. So this doesn't really apply to mining companies and financial services because of the regulations that they're driven by and the peculiarity of the business. And when it comes to amount B, it is basically, for smaller countries to look at where there are significant operations but may not be market countries, so to say. So these are essentially the key concepts that we will be looking at. There is a lot more in-depth analysis that can be done, and we could probably even have one separate session on OECD Pillar 1 and 2 itself, because this is very high level, initial thoughts.
I think moving on to the other pillar, the pillar 2. So I think just to sort of understand the background, while pillar 1 essentially addresses tax challenges arising on account of digital economy, pillar 2 is focused on addressing the other base erosion and profit shifting challenges. So then this sort of being the broad conceptual segregation. What pillar 2 does seek to do is provide like a systematic solution in such a way that a large M&E, and I mean there is a certain threshold criteria around this which we will come to in the next slide. A large M&E pays a certain minimum percentage of tax regardless of the jurisdiction or its constituent entities, regardless of the jurisdiction in which its constituent entities have operations. So say for instance, there is a like a large multinational enterprise that has say 5 entities in say treaty favored jurisdictions. They say a couple of entities in in jurisdictions that levy high rate of corporate taxes. What pillar 2 does really try to do is that it sets a base and it says, okay, at a group level, there is a certain minimum that will have to be paid. If there is a shortfall in certain jurisdictions, then that differential sort of needs to be recouped and paid by, say, the ultimate parent. So that is really the idea behind this. Now, I think one thing that that has been clarified with the introduction of this is that the idea of pillar 2 is not really to mandate any jurisdiction to levy a minimum corporate tax. So that's not the challenge. So if say the tax rate that is agreed under pillar 2 is at a certain, is say higher than the corporate tax rate of say of a certain jurisdiction, then there is no mandate on that jurisdiction to sort of increase its base tax rate. So that is not the idea. And I think similar to the previous one, the idea even for pillar 2 is to look at the aggregate taxes of a group and not an aggregate income of a group, not really look at each fragment and each entity. So I think we'll come to the next slide. So pillar 2 applies to very large multinational groups, and the consolidated group revenue threshold that is provided is euro 750 million or above in the immediately preceding financial year. And here again, it is applicable to generally all M&E industries. There are certain only specific excluded entities which are provided, say investment funds, pension funds, government entities, international organizations, etc. Apart from that, it is applicable to all. We have, I think, an example here. Again, just to sort of conceptually understand it, I think as Priya said, there are ample nitty-gritties into how each of these are supposed to get applied and how do they get computed. But just to understand what we're talking about, I think we've taken a simple example. So we're looking at a group holding structure. C is the ultimate parent. It holds A1 and A2 through B, and there is a P. All of these three are in state A. Now, I think as we discussed in the previous slide, the idea is to aggregate income and aggregate taxes. So in this example, say A1, A2, and P have 100, 120, and 130 taxes, as you know, and say these add up to 351. And they have income of 1,200, 1,400, and 1,300, and they add up to income of 3,900. So we look at the effective tax rate at the group level. Now, covered taxes in general is understood, or rather is defined to include taxes on income, and not just direct corporate taxes to income, but also dividend taxes or any other taxes that are levied on retained earnings or say any corporate equity. And of course, this would then have to be seen jurisdiction wise. And so that will also be an area of discussion as to what really do I include in covered taxes. So, when we look at the effective tax rate, and yet again, effective tax rate will have nitty-gritties around what do I consider as a profit to compute effective tax rate, because, different jurisdictions could have different accounting principles. So, discussion around how that we align that. But anyway, in this example, we compute an ETR of 9% at the group level, and assuming that a minimum tax rate of 10% has been agreed in case of pillar 2 by the contracting entities. In such a case, 1% top-up tax will have to be paid for each of these each of these entities. So for A1, we will have, the group will have to pay 1% tax on the income of 1200. For A2, 1% of 1400, and for the P, another 1% of 1300. Effectively, this needs to come up to 10%. So that being the idea, and not really looking at each individual jurisdiction. And I think this, this blending, I think as it is called in the Pillar 2 draft, or rather the Pillar 2 blueprint term, this blending, what really it aims at doing is that it neutralizes the impact of corporate taxes that fluctuate. Say, as against this, if this 9% effective tax rate or say the 10% threshold were to be looked at for each independent jurisdiction, then the offsetting advantage that a group has by the taxes of a higher taxes or other taxes paid by a entity in a higher tax rate jurisdiction versus taxes paid by an entity in a low tax jurisdiction, that netting that this blending is allowing, that would not have been possible if this were looked at an independent level. And the other thing is here as well, the pooling of income, or rather the effective tax rate, or say, really the base has to be at the parent entities level. So when we talk about Pillar 2, it talks about a top-down approach, starting from the highest parent entity, and then again, depending on whether they have adopted this and whether they're signatories or they have adopted, the Pillar 2 as such, we go each step down. So that is broadly the way that it is computed. Now, Pillar 2 is looked at across 4 rules. We'll be discussing each of these individually. Again, briefly, the income inclusion rule really says that for foreign controlled enterprises, their income and tax has to be pooled, and taxes on income has to be paid by the ultimate parent. So when we say income inclusion, what we're trying to say is that if there is an entity in a low tax rate jurisdiction, that income needs to be pooled along with the foreign the foreign parent, and the differential tax, which is below the base minimum tax, will have to be paid by the foreign parent in its own jurisdiction. Now, interestingly, I think when we have something as I think as revolutionary coming in, maybe if I can use that word for lack of anything better, when we have something like that coming in, the interplay with existing treaty provisions becomes really interesting. So, say if I come back to the same example, if you look at C Limited and P, alone, in the way that our treaty networks operate today, the taxation rights on a P are typically with the source state. So in this example as well, they would typically be with state A only. But when we're talking about Pillar 2, what we're saying is that if the P is paying taxes below the minimum threshold, then state C should also get taxing rights to pay the differential. So then this becomes a slight deviation from the tax treaties and the P and the nexus rules. And then this is sort of an enabler to give the source state again taxing rights on income of the P, to again ensure that the minimum corporate tax rate is maintained. So that is on the switch over rule. Right? So to say that this is to bring overseas permanent establishment within the scope of income inclusion rule, and the switch over rule would permit the resident state to tax the low tax profits of a P up to the agreed minimum rate, using the same ETR test as in the income inclusion rule. So I think once you determine the ETR, that net tax rate needs to match up to that. I think coming to the other 2 rules, think these are broadly supplementary to the larger idea here. Now, typically what happens is, say, if by application of the income inclusion rules that we had discussed in the previous example, if even after application of that, there is a state that is going untaxed, then there is an undertax payment rule that requires again the foreign entity to pay the differential tax. So essentially what's happening is all of these have to be looked at and have been formulated in conjunction with each other to meet the objective. Now, in the same example, if we have to, look at what are we really talking about? Say here, if say there is a state B and there is a state C and a P, if state C has not really adopted income inclusion rules, then the tax of the income tax of the P may not really meet up the base minimum threshold of 15%. So then that undertax payment rule really tries to cover up, or say to sort of mend those scenarios or ensure that the base rate of tax is met. Of course, this would have to be looked at on a case-to-case basis, and again, this is sort of an aspect that has like a lot of deliberation around it. Now, the subject to tax rule is really addressing or rather allocating rights of intra-group payments. Now, there could be intra-group payments that are, and these are mostly in the nature of passive income, which may not be subjected to minimum effective tax rates. So then in such cases, the subject to tax rules is also an attempt to sort of ensure that the net tax rate, even after putting in place these intra-group payments, does match up to the base rate that has been agreed. So, so again, this could either say be achieved by denial of the deduction of that intra-group payment, or that could be one of the modes. So say, for example, if this is getting paid to a low tax rate jurisdiction, then one mechanism could be that you do not provide deduction of it. Again, there could be other measures, but yeah, this be broadly the idea around it. So both of these basically target base eroding payments, which are made with an intent to gain tax advantage out of difference in tax rates. So that being the broad idea. I think when we talk about digital taxes, we can, one I think relevant area would be that India is not really the only country that has introduced it. There are other as well. So we have laid that out briefly. I think here we have Austria, India, Italy, Spain, Turkey, United Kingdom. I think if we were to really look at that list, I think one would note that the idea everywhere really does seem to be to target digital transactions, in the sense that when we look at it, I think a majority of these are either some sort of an advertising service or an intermediary service, or say a sale of data. Again, sale of data being a very important aspect, in fact a policy issue, considering the value that can just be attributed to it today, and say other sort of digital advertising services, etc. So broadly the range here has been between, I think, 2% to 7.5% across countries. I think that's it. I think any of you have had any questions?
Put up full screen. I think the questions are lining up. We will address it towards the end. So maybe you can continue with what you're presenting, but we can't see your slides.
Sorry, I think I'll just. I'm sorry, I think.
It's visible now. Please, can you put it on full screen?
Okay, it's visible. Now, okay, now it's fine. I think, yeah.
Sanjana, I think it's not. Yeah, it's on full screen now.
It's up, right? Okay.
Yes.
This is a ruling in the context of equalization levy. I think we'll just walk you through this. So this is in the case of MasterCard. I mean, the facts of this go as MasterCard had obtained an AR verdict, for which it was held that the activities of MasterCard in India constitute a permanent establishment. MasterCard went on on a writ against this AR ruling before the Delhi High Court. And while this was pending before the Delhi High Court, prior to the disposal, equalization levy was introduced, and MasterCard filed a supplementary application. So what MasterCard said that is that it is of the belief that it is not really liable to tax in India by way of constitution of a permanent establishment, because none of its core activities are carried out in India. But given the introduction of equalization levy 2.0, which is the 2% levy now, that could sort of trigger here, for the reason that equalization levy is triggered when there isn't a permanent establishment, and non-residents that have a permanent establishment in India are not subjected to tax for equalization levy. So MasterCard filed this application saying that we're of the view that we should not be subjected to income attribution as PE. And in case equalization levy later on is levied to us, we should not really be liable to pay any penalty and interest, for the reason that we sort of not paid equalization levy in time, and MasterCard had deposited taxes on the income attributed to India. So I think while this application was filed, the department's contention really was that the department is of the view that there is a permanent establishment in India, and it does not really wish for MasterCard to deposit equalization levy because there is an income attributable. And if at all, subsequently, if equalization levy is going to, it will get triggered, then if MasterCard will be required to pay penalty and interest, even the department will have to sort of refund their taxes along with the interest. So to that extent, I think none of the sides will, will have anything to do. So yeah, to that effect, after this, I think application, or rather after this, affidavit of the tax authorities, MasterCard did not sort of press this matter any further. But yeah, this was something that had gone up to the High Court on this issue of. I think that's it. And I think I'll just add briefly, I think Priya was also in the beginning of this, I don't have that slide handy, so I think I'll just cover that conceptually. In the beginning, Priya was also referring to an international, like a tax ruling in the Bangalore ITAT. So that was in the case of Urban Ladder. It's a fairly recent one. So I think one of the key areas that was discussed there was the tax.
I think probably you could just give the background of the cases prior to 2016, and then how things have changed after 2016 in respect of advertisement, and then maybe get into the case.
Sure, Priya, sure, I'll do that. So I think I think 2016 again. I'll just clarify. So Priya mentioning 2016, we're talking about TDS, or rather taxes on advertising prior to introduction of equalization levy. So I think as we discussed that time as well, what used to happen is advertising, I think as we know today, or as is done, with platforms say such as Facebook and Google, or say, the advertising that is say today targeted to us by all of these non-residents, that even for the parties that are advertising their products is a lot more real-time interactive kind of advertisement. So unlike the earlier times where it used to be like a simpliciter banner display, or say like a video or something to that extent, or say just like content display, advertising now entails like use of sophisticated technology, and also to some extent say use of some sort of a server or software, etc. So prior to introduction of equalization levy in 2016, an argument that the department or the tax authorities would come up with is that because advertisement as such involves, a right to use, or rather involves usage of servers and processes and software, etc. Such payments can be categorized as royalty or fees for technical services. And I think needless to say, considering the Karnataka High Court ruling in case of Samsung had held that, even sort of a payment towards a shrink wrap software with very limited usage rights is also royalty. That was one ruling that significant reliance would get placed on, because I think all of us would agree in the Karnataka jurisdiction that used to be like, I think, one non-rebuttable argument to say that because the Karnataka High Court says that any sort of usage of a software or a server or any and the like is in the nature of royalty or fees for technical services. The similar holds good for advertisement also. I think as assessees, there were, even that at that time there were arguments to say that any use of technology that is incidental to a much larger purpose, or say to a service of advertising, should not really get subjected to royalty and fees for technical services. And I think in the case of Google, this matter had traveled up to the Bangalore ITAT. I think there, and this was a ruling pronounced in 2019 and 20. It was something that was discussed about at large, to say that there the advertising assistance that was provided by Google Ireland was subjected to TDS's royalty. Now, with this background, when engineering analysis had come out earlier this year, then it was time for, I think, all taxpayers to look at their past litigation around what happens to all of these cases where Samsung was relied on, including in case of advertising, and the payments were characterized as royalty even for end usage. So one recent ruling in case of Urban Ladder of the Bangalore ITAT, I think that came a month, I think approximately a month ago, said that there also the nature of payment that was being looked at was payment to Facebook for advertisement. And in that case, while the AO and the CIT have discussed that such an advertisement does entail access to sophisticated processes and sophisticated software servers, etc., and therefore should be liable to taxes as royalty. The Bangalore ITAT, relying on the ruling of engineering analysis, has said that any end usage that does not really give any commercial right to the payer in any server or software, etc., in absence of any commercial right as such, the payments made cannot be characterized as royalty. And the decision, sort of this, and then the Bangalore ITAT had ruled this in favor of the assessee to say that these advertising payments made to Facebook Ireland do not really constitute royalty, because there are no commercial rights that Urban Ladder is getting in the server or the software of Facebook by making these payments. That usage is only incidental, and it's only the end use for its own purpose, not any commercial exploitation rights. I think that is one interesting ruling that I think we all got to see, and I think we're hoping for further such developments.
Yeah, and on that count, I think probably it's not the first of the case, while it is the first probably in our jurisdiction. I think we've had Yahoo, Pinstrom, Caraclane rulings from other jurisdictions as well. And as of now, we don't have a ruling which is otherwise, but largely all of them do agree with the view that in a case where advertisement services were provided remote offline, and the non-resident has probably never visited India or done nothing in India, then these transactions are not subject to tax as royalty or as FTS, and therefore there should not be a withholding tax applicable. And I think those have been the summary of rulings so far. But yes, things did change after 2016 when we had the EQL, and things did shift into EQL. And talking about EQL, I think we've got a couple of queries. I will pick up one, and Sanjana, I will request you to pick up the other. I will just read out the first query for the benefit of audience, and Sanjana, if you can help answer this. What is the nature of equalization levy 2? Whether it should be charged to customer or to be paid out of pocket by non-resident. And I think this is a very interesting question, because the first levy was definitely a levy where the Indian entity had to discharge, and it was not a withholding tax, so to say. And should that have been a withholding tax? And under the income tax law, significant difference would have been that the non-resident could have probably claimed credit of those taxes in his home jurisdiction. And to that extent, it would have been a tax neutral levy. But the way EQL is structured, it's not part of the income tax law, and therefore when it comes in under the Finance Act as a separate piece of law, you don't tax it as income tax, and therefore it's a levy. And now when it's a levy, you are actually in the earlier piece of EQL, which was the 2016 version on advertisement services, you have to pay. So if, for example, the non-resident invoice is 100 rupees, and you pay 6% of it. So the Indian entity pays 6 to the government, and remits 100 to the non-resident. So that is how it's structured. But Sanjana, would you like to just, recapitulate the difference between the earlier one and the current one, which is, I think in the current one, the scope is also larger. So maybe we can just, quickly go through that one.
Sure, Priya. So I think one stark difference between the current levy and the old levy being that the manner of collection is different. So in the first one, the version one, which was 6% on advertising, the responsibility of depositing this equalization levy was on the Indian resident payer. This obligation now moves to the non-resident, and the non-resident is required to, as such, discharge it on his income in India. So that incidence of compliance then to that extent shifts, and that follows, of course, something of this sort. Then again follows, obtaining PAN and depositing and obtaining all relevant tax registrations and then paying it. So the rate between both of them being different. So the earlier one was 6%. This is 2% of the gross consideration, as the section clearly brings out. In terms of the scope, the previous one was specifically on advertising and other sort of, say, advertising, even support services to some extent. The second version is much broader and uses the uses terminology of online sale of goods or online provision of services, where online sale of goods is not only defined to mean physical goods that are entirely concluded on an e-commerce platform, but even when, say, certain fragments of such a transaction are concluded on an e-commerce platform. So the second one is more broader in coverage. The first one that had come in 2016 was fairly restrictive to that extent. So I think that's the broader.
Sure. And we have another question which I will pick up, and the question says, thank you for the session, timely and helpful. I'm really grateful that you could make time to attend it. Thank you for that. Going back to e-commerce EL, few companies have not complied with 2% EL during FY 2021, mostly due to lack of clarity. How should they approach EQL levy compliances in the current year? I think we would like to just clarify that, it's very case specific, the applicability of EQL, and it may not be possible to comment on, the stands taken by different companies and the reasons behind it. So probably, it requires more of a fact specific analysis, to understand how this has to be levied and how the compliance should be undertaken. So I think we may need to get into specific facts for any, understanding this in greater detail. We have another question. Let me just scroll down. I understand that the ruling in the case of Urban Ladder discusses only one limb of royalty copyright, whether taxability of online advertisement would be out of other limbs as well, that is process royalty, etc.
I think in the case of Urban Ladder, I think that's actually rightly mentioned. It only talks about royalty, and also, so to say, if we do look at the
only one limb of royalty dealing with copyright.
Only one limb of royalty. No, absolutely right.
Yeah. So the other limbs of royalty, can that get attracted is the question.
Yeah, that's an interesting one then. So the other limbs of royalty, I think, if we were to again look at other, say, aspects of Urban Ladder as well, I think if we look at, the discussion that it has on AWS cloud services, etc., where it's talking about access to servers and access to other technology. I think if we, take cognizance of it, I understand it's, it's basically drawing the similar analogy to say that any uses as such that is only limited to an end user access and does not really talk about commercial exploitation. To that extent, it cannot, to that extent, it falls beyond the scope of royalty. I think, having said that, I think yes, it is something that might have to be seen from other aspects as well. But really, the crux of it, to say that we are not talking about any commercial exploitation, right, and we are only talking about right to use it. That, and the fact that that has been discussed as part of the ruling, that can still sort of be relied on. And one other aspect that this ruling does not talk about is characterization of the similar payment as fees for technical services, because again, that could also come in there is certain process, etc., that is there in place. So then whether that gets covered or not. So while again the ruling does not discuss that, I think a similar issue has been decided by the Chennai ITAT in case of CARET-late, and in that ruling it says that such a payment does not get characterized as fees for technical services. So yes, to that extent, this the discussion on characterization here in this ruling was not as extensive. It had broadly drawn reference from engineering analysis and had concluded that the payments are not available.
And I think that question is quite relevant from the analysis point of view, because when we look at royalties, the definition has many limbs, and I think one limb is copyright or of literary, artistic, or scientific work, including cinematograph films or tapes used for radio or television broadcasting. And we are saying that it is definitely not copyright that is being shared. And then the next limb is, can it be a patent? No. Is it a trademark? No. Can it be design or model? In this particular case where advertisement services are being rendered, there is no design or model or plan that is being shared. Now, coming to the next limb, which is tricky, which is relating to secret formula or process. I think what is relevant to note here is, if there is a unique formula that is being applied in order to render the services, or a unique process, that is to say the formula should be secret or the process should be secret, because the comma over here comes after process. If any of this is secret in nature, then the question of secret process can come in. However, in advertisement services, there is no process that is being shared by the service provider to the service recipient. And therefore, the question, to my mind, should not come under the limb of secret process or secret formula, because essentially for me, a secret process or formula would mean, say a company has expertise in manufacturing a particular product, and that formula or product is shared with another company, whether group or third party, for undertaking the activities of manufacturing. And that sharing of process or a formula, which is only known to the head office, or rather, which is only known to the company which owns that right, can really come here. But the mere rendition of advertisement services should not come. And I think similarly, if you look at the other clauses, it talks about information concerning industrial, commercial, or scientific experience. And I think that is another area where, there can be doubt around whether, there is any information concerning industrial, commercial, or scientific experience. Again, there have been debates around that. And the answer over here is that these services are rendered purely based on push and pull requests from the website, and therefore it should not really tantamount to any industrial or scientific information. I think these are the broad levels, but yes, it is an interesting aspect. And again, it would be very case specific to analyze on this. I think we are done with the questions. There aren't any unless I have missed. Give me a minute to just check. Don't
In
think there are any.
Chat box, there is a question.
Yeah. I have answered that, sir. What is the nature of EL? Whether it's
Yeah, you
charged?
already answered. Okay, fine.
Yes, sir.
Otherwise, I think you are done.
Yeah, so I think we have completed the session. In terms of the content, we have another 5 minutes. If anybody has questions, we're happy to listen. Or, I leave it to you, sir. So I think you are on mute. I can't hear you.
Yeah, we have a few more minutes. If you have anything else to discuss, yeah, continue. I think questions, no other pending.
Yeah, Sanjana, do you want to summarize, so far what we've discussed?
Sure. I think just to sort of briefly sum up, I think tax challenges of digital economy is a subject that has been evolving. I think when we looked at the timeline, we're talking about it from the year 2013 onwards. I think with the development in digital economy in India and across countries, there was a pressing need to sort of address this. I think while there is, definitely like a lot of discussion that will happen around it. India had, undertaken a couple of measures by introducing equalization levy, significant economic presence, 194O provisions, which though are, which are fairly recent and had a lot of interpretational challenges. I think that we all must be addressing as part of, our practice. So that we've been looking at. And I think as we do go ahead, we'll have more precedents to sort of, look at and deliberate on. Now, with that aside, when we look ahead, we'll probably be focusing more on the pillars that we spoke about, because that being the most recent amendment now, I think that would serve as the base for taxation going forward, where instead of really looking at a jurisdiction specific taxation, we'll be looking at taxation collectively at group global levels, and we'll be, accordingly levying taxes on that. And with that, I'm sure there will be a lot of, again, areas to deliberate on as to how do all of these complex calculation works. And and I think as we implement that as well, there could potentially be certain more issues that would come up, and that may have to be, say, addressed on a more real-time basis. So pillar 1, pillar 2 is something that we did briefly touch upon today, but I think it's a really vast topic, as Priya also, I think, mentioned at the beginning. So that is definitely going to be something to, watch out for and to pick up now. And it's also going to be relevant in all, I think, our discussions as well. So I think that's broadly it. And
yeah, we are not the only country that has a digital taxes levy. There are others. But we have multiple levies, and probably like others, we are also evolving, and therefore many of these things are subject to clarifications, and it's understandably so, because it's a very, very fast-paced area where growth is really very fast. So it does take some time to evaluate and come back with an approach. With that, I think we would like to conclude the session. We really are grateful to the Institute for giving us this opportunity. Thank you, Shetty sir, for this, and also thank you to everybody who has signed in and spent 2 hours over here with us to hear some bit of the digital taxes that we have in the Indian context today. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a fabulous session, a detailed analysis of digital economic taxation with the recent developments. Thank you very much. On behalf of Bangalore branch and on behalf of all the participants here, our wholehearted thanks to CA Priya Narayanan, CA Sanjana Davar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We had a fabulous session. Participants, you are the reason for this program. Thank you very much to each one of you. Please visit bangalore.icai.org for all our upcoming programs. 21st to 24th, 4 days company law workshop is there. I request all of you to register and also spread this message to in your office and to colleagues and friends. With that note, thank you very much. Happy Dasara once again. Thank you. Good night.